Richard the Lionheart. You know the name. It just sounds epic, right? Conjures up images of a noble knight, a hero on a crusade, basically the perfect English king. But what if the story we all know is mostly just a myth? All right, let's get into it and peel back the layers on the real, complicated, and honestly, fascinating King Richard I.
So, who was he, really? The legendary hero from the storybooks? A brilliant but totally ruthless warlord? Or, and this is a big one, a contested queer icon whose life historians are still fighting over? Well, the thing is, the answer isn't that simple. He was kinda all of these things at once, and we're gonna unpack that right now.
Okay, first things first. Let's just acknowledge the legend. You know the one. The popular image of Richard is this chivalrous crusader, the best warrior around, the good king fighting bad guys in a faraway land. This is the Richard you see in movies, the one that became this huge symbol of English pride.
But yeah, that heroic storybook image, it starts to fall apart pretty quick when you actually look at the history. The real Richard was driven by this intense, almost terrifying ambition. And there is no better monument to that ambition than the ruins of his absolute favorite castle.
This is Chateau Gaillard. It's sitting high above the River Seine in Normandy. And let me tell you, this was not just another castle. Nope, this was a statement. This thing was a monument to Richard's sheer force of will, his strategic brain, and his absolute need to dominate anyone who stood against him.
The whole point of it was pretty simple. Protect his lands in Normandy from his biggest rival, King Philip of France, and use it as a launchpad to take back territory he'd lost. He was so determined, he actually seized the land from an archbishop who didn't want to give it up, and just ignored the church when they got mad. So mad that for a while, the dead couldn't even be buried. Richard was not going to be stopped. And the cost? I mean, wow. Between 1196 and 1198, he dropped an estimated £12,000 on this one single project. Now, to put that into perspective for you, that is way more than the £7,000 he spent on all the castles in England during his entire 10-year reign. And get this, he built it in just 2 years. A massive, cutting-edge stone fortress like this should have taken close to a decade. The fact that it went up so fast just shows you how obsessed he was. He was on site all the time, personally pushing the work forward.
And you can tell how proud he was of it. After only a year of construction, he apparently looked at it and said, "Behold, how fair is this year-old daughter of mine." To him, this wasn't just some military outpost, it was his baby, his creation.
So it really makes you wonder, right? Was this fortress a stroke of strategic genius, just a smart defense against a major threat? Or was it something else? A monument to one king's massive ego, built no matter the cost? This is where that clean, heroic image starts getting pretty messy.
And that ruthless drive? Oh, it wasn't just for building projects. It was right at the center of the thing he's most famous for, the Third Crusade. And while everyone knows him as this great crusader, his actions at the Siege of Acre show a cold, hard pragmatism that usually gets left out of the legend.
So the Siege of Acre had been this brutal 2-year-long slog. By the time Richard showed up in June 1191, everybody was exhausted, the Christian attackers and the Muslim defenders. But his arrival, along with the French king, completely changed the game, and just a month later, the city surrendered.
Now, the surrender terms were supposed to be straightforward. Saladin would pay a huge ransom, free a bunch of Christian prisoners, and return a piece of the true cross. In return, the Muslim soldiers defending Acre would be allowed to live. But the negotiations just stalled. Saladin sent the first payment, but Richard sent it back, saying some of the key people were missing.
This left Richard with a really big problem. He was sitting on thousands of prisoners from the city. To be specific, about 2,700 men.
Convinced Saladin was just dragging his feet on purpose, Richard made a call. A truly chilling one. On August 20th, 1191, he ordered all 2,700 of those Muslim prisoners to be marched outside the city walls and executed in plain sight. Saladin, of course, retaliated by killing the Christian prisoners he held. This was the brutal, horrifying reality of holy war, a long, long way from any kind of chivalrous legend.
All right, so this brings us to what might be the most personal and for sure the most fiercely debated part of Richard's life, the evidence around his sexuality. And just to be clear, this isn't some modern idea we're forcing onto the past. This is a debate that goes all the way back to the people writing about him when he was alive. And here's the thing.
Some of the most powerful evidence comes from writers who actually liked Richard. A chronicler named Roger of Howden wrote about this incredibly intense bond between Richard and the French King Philip back in 1187. He says they ate from the same plate, and at night, quote, the bed did not separate them. He even uses the phrase vehement love to describe it.
And it wasn't just a one-time thing either. On at least 2 different occasions, church officials basically called him out. They warned him to stop his unlawful behavior and repent for the sin of Sodom, which was the medieval term for same-sex relations. And Richard actually performed public acts of penance because of it.
This is a perfect example of how history isn't just a set of facts, it's an ongoing argument. On one side, you have historians like John Gillingham. They say, look, this is all being misread. Bed sharing could be a political ritual, and the church stuff was just generic criticism or political mudslinging. But then on the other side, you have historians like Hilary Rhodes and William Burgwinkle, who argue the evidence is overwhelming. The language is specific, the warnings are repeated, and, this is the key part, they come from people who admired Richard, not from his enemies.
So, we have the myth, the brutal reality, and this deeply personal debate. Why do we keep coming back to this guy from the 12th century? Well, it's because the arguments about who he was actually force us to think about who we are.
I mean, think about the different versions of Richard we've seen. There's the master builder, the obsessive genius who created a military masterpiece. There's the ruthless crusader, a man capable of ordering a mass execution. And there's the contested icon, whose personal life is still being fought over hundreds of years later. He's like a mirror that reflects our own values back at us.
Because ultimately, the debates about Richard aren't really just about the 12th century. They're about how we, right now, define what a hero is. They're about our own complicated feelings on war and what it means to be a nation. And they are absolutely about whose stories and whose love we decide are important enough to be included in history.
Historian Hilary Rhodes just nails it with this question. She asks why everyone is so quick to say it's anachronistic, historically out of place, to talk about homosexuality in the Middle Ages, but no one ever bats an eye when we apply our modern ideas of heterosexuality to the past. It's such a powerful point about the biases we all bring to the stories we tell. Which brings us all the way back to the big question. After we strip away the Hollywood legend, after we've looked at the fortress and the massacre and the primary sources, who was the real Richard the Lionheart? Maybe there isn't one single real Richard. There's the military genius, the ruthless politician, the man who loved other men, the icon of the Crusades. The version of him that we choose to focus on, the part we either celebrate or condemn, well, that might just tell us a whole lot more about our own world than it ever could about his.